stop pretending you believe. Every time you fake it, you confess doubt to the law. Imagination does not reward effort. It responds only to conviction. Assume it, or stay exhausted forever. There is a quiet lie most people are never taught to question because it is disguised as encouragement. You are told to act confident before you feel it, to speak success before it exists, to smile before there is any reason to. Culture calls this strength. It calls it strategy. But beneath the surface, this habit of pretending is not empowerment at all. It is a subtle form of self-betrayal. It trains you to perform an identity you do not accept as real, and then wonders why the performance leaves you drained. The exhaustion you feel is not from effort. It is from dishonesty with self. This is where Neville's teaching cuts cleanly through modern noise. Imagination does not respond to theatrics. It does not respond to volume, repetition, or emotional display. It responds to conviction. Not the kind you demonstrate outwardly, but the kind that settles inwardly and no longer argues. You can say the right words, strike the right posture, and mirror the behavior of someone successful, yet remain unchanged. Because imagination is not impressed by acting. It is moved only when the inner verdict is final. Neville made a sharp distinction that most people overlook: the difference between the actor and the being. An actor can cry on cue, wear the costume, and deliver the lines flawlessly, yet once the curtain falls, his life remains the same. The character never changes reality. Only the assumed state does, and the assumed state is not something you try to convince yourself of. It is something you quietly consent to as true. This is why so many people feel like imposters while doing everything right. They are rehearsing a role instead of occupying a state. This is also why Abdullah, Neville's teacher, refused all language of effort. He would not entertain trying, hoping, or pretending. His stance was blunt to the point of discomfort. You either are, or you are not. There was no sympathy for performance, because performance implies doubt. To him, the moment you say you are trying to be something, you have already confessed that you believe you are not. And imagination, being faithful, reflects that confession perfectly. By the end of this discussion, you will understand something most never articulate clearly. Pretending feels heavy because it is an inner argument that never resolves. Assumption feels quiet because it ends the debate. One requires constant maintenance, reinforcement, and emotional fuel. The other feels strangely final, almost boring, because nothing inside you is pushing back. When you stop lying to yourself, you stop needing to prove anything at all, and that is where real change begins. What most people misinterpret as effort is actually resistance wearing the mask of discipline. When you are pretending, there is always a subtle strain beneath the surface, a constant monitoring of yourself to make sure the mask does not slip. You are watching your tone, your posture, your words, and your reactions, not because they feel natural, but because you are afraid that if you relax even slightly, the truth of how you really see yourself will show. This is why faking it never brings peace. It demands vigilance. It asks you to hold an inner position that contradicts what you actually believe, and contradiction always produces tension. Pretending is like holding a smile for a photograph that takes too long to capture. At first, the expression feels light, almost effortless, but as the seconds pass, the muscles begin to ache. Your face tightens, your jaw stiffens, and the relief only comes when you are finally allowed to stop. Being, on the other hand, requires no such effort. When you are genuinely amused, confident, or secure, there is nothing to hold in place. The state supports itself. There is no countdown in your body, no silent plea for the moment to end. This is the clue most people overlook. If maintaining a state feels exhausting, it is not because you are doing something wrong externally, it is because you are internally divided. One part of you is trying to move forward, while another part is quietly objecting. You may call it discipline, consistency, or commitment, but imagination recognizes it for what it is: unbelief. Effort, in this sense, is not a virtue. It is evidence that the inner verdict has not been reached. Assumption feels quiet precisely because it ends this inner argument. When something is assumed, it no longer requires reinforcement. You do not need to remind yourself of what you already accept as true. You do not feel compelled to signal it outwardly, to exaggerate it, or to defend it. The nervous system settles. The body relaxes. There is a sense of neutrality that people often mistake for indifference, when in reality, it is certainty without noise. This is why people who live from assumption often appear understated, even unimpressive to those who are still performing. There is no urgency in them, no dramatic insistence. They are not trying to convince themselves or anyone else. Their energy is not spent on maintenance because there is nothing to maintain. The state is stable, and stability, unlike performance, does not fatigue the mind. When you notice heaviness in your practice, it is not a signal to push harder. It is a signal to look inward and ask where you are still arguing with yourself. Exhaustion is not produced by effort alone. It is produced by effort that goes against belief. Once belief aligns, effort dissolves naturally. What remains is a quiet, almost unnoticed sense of being. And that quietness is the signature of assumption taking root. Performance is a confession of lack. There is an uncomfortable truth hidden beneath performance, and it is this: every action taken to prove something is quietly admitting that the thing is not yet accepted as real. Performance looks productive on the surface, but psychologically, it is a confession. It says, "I am not convinced, so I must demonstrate." This is why so much outward effort feels strangely hollow. It is not rooted in certainty. It is driven by fear of being exposed as someone who does not yet believe their own claim. You never rehearse a role you believe you already live. Rehearsal exists only where doubt exists. An actor practices lines because he fears forgetting them, missing the cue, or breaking character. He knows the role is not his identity. It is something he must remember to maintain. In the same way, when you find yourself constantly reminding, affirming, correcting, or compensating, you are revealing an inner fear that the state will collapse if you stop managing it. And imagination listens closely to that fear. This is why outward action, when disconnected from inner acceptance, becomes self-sabotaging. Every exaggerated display of confidence, every forced declaration, every carefully curated behavior is not neutral. It communicates something inwardly. It says this is fragile, this needs support. And what imagination supports is not the performance, but the belief underneath it. If the belief is lack, then lack is what solidifies. Words especially betray this more clearly than people realize. When speech is used as a tool to convince rather than to express, it carries strain. The tone tightens. The rhythm becomes mechanical. There is an urgency behind it that feels like persuasion rather than declaration. This is not because the words are wrong, but because the speaker does not stand behind them. Language, when not backed by identity, becomes noise. The danger here is subtle. Performance can feel responsible. It can feel disciplined. It can even feel virtuous. But it keeps you locked in a loop where action replaces acceptance. You stay busy proving instead of settling. And the more you prove, the more you reinforce the assumption that proof is needed. This is why people can work tirelessly on themselves and yet feel no closer to change. They are polishing the costume while avoiding the inner decision. Once this is seen clearly, attention naturally turns inward. If action reveals belief, then the real question is not what you are doing, but who you believe yourself to be while doing it. If your words feel strained, it is not a speech problem. If your behavior feels forced, it is not a discipline problem. It is an identity problem. And until identity is addressed, performance will continue to confess the very lack it is trying to hide. Affirmations fail, not because words lack power, but because words without identity are hollow. When inner speech does not arise from a settled sense of self, it becomes mechanical, repetitive, and strangely exhausting. The mind can repeat phrases endlessly, yet nothing shifts, because imagination is not moved by sound alone. It responds to the position from which the sound emerges. If the speaker is still standing in desire, the words carry desire. If the speaker is standing in lack, the words echo lack, no matter how positive they appear on the surface. This is why repetition, by itself, has never been the deciding factor. A parrot can repeat words flawlessly, but meaning only emerges when a mind stands behind the voice. The parrot has sound without awareness, and many affirmations function in exactly the same way. They are recited faithfully, sometimes obsessively, yet remain disconnected from any inner conviction. The individual hopes the words will eventually overpower doubt, not realizing that doubt is the very source from which the words are being spoken. When affirmations come from desire, they carry a subtle pleading tone. Even if the language is confident, the emotional undercurrent reveals the truth. There is an invisible gap between the statement and the speaker, a sense that the words are aimed at the future rather than resting in the present. Imagination does not bridge that gap. It reflects it, and so the affirmation, instead of closing distance, reinforces it by reminding the mind that the state is not yet occupied. Identity changes everything. When inner speech arises from identity, there is no effort to persuade. The words feel casual, sometimes almost unimportant. They are not charged with urgency, because nothing is being chased. They function more like commentary than commands. This is why people who truly assume a state often speak very little about it. Their inner dialogue is not busy convincing itself. It is simply aligned. Neville's real instruction was never about phrasing, it was always about feeling. And feeling in this sense is not emotion, but acceptance. It is the sense of reality that accompanies something you no longer question. When identity is present, words become secondary. When identity is missing, words are used as compensation. The failure of affirmations is not a failure of technique, but a revelation of where the speaker still stands. Once this is understood, the struggle with affirmations dissolves. The question is no longer which words to use or how often to repeat them. The question becomes quieter and far more direct. From what version of self is this inner speech emerging? Until that is answered, repetition will remain sound without substance. When it is answered, the words almost become unnecessary because the state has already been assumed. One of the most misunderstood signs in this work is the difference between excitement and naturalness. Many people chase emotional highs, assuming that intensity is evidence of alignment. They look for enthusiasm, inspiration, or a rush of certainty, believing that these feelings signal success. But excitement is unstable by nature. It rises quickly, peaks briefly, and then fades, leaving the mind searching for the next emotional confirmation. Naturalness, by contrast, is quiet, grounded, and almost invisible to the one experiencing it. You do not feel thrilled that gravity works. You do not wake up each morning emotionally charged by the fact that the ground will support your feet. There is no celebration, no affirmation, no inner speech reminding you that gravity exists. You feel settled. You live from the assumption without thinking about it. That same neutrality marks a state that has been truly assumed. It no longer needs emotional proof because it is not questioned. Excitement often signals transition rather than arrival. It appears when something still feels new, uncertain, or not fully integrated. There is a sense of anticipation, of watching to see whether the feeling will hold. Naturalness appears when that watching stops. The state feels ordinary, even dull to the mind that craves stimulation. This is why many abandon assumption prematurely. They mistake the loss of excitement for failure, when in reality it is the sign that the state is becoming normal. When a state is natural, there is no inner dialogue trying to sustain it. There is no mental rehearsal, no checking to see if it is still there. The mind does not circle back to it repeatedly because it no longer stands out. It blends into the background of experience. This blending is what gives assumption its power. The state stops being observed and starts being lived. Once naturalness is understood, pretending becomes impossible to justify. Performance depends on emotion. It needs energy, expression, and reinforcement. Naturalness needs none of these. It is self-sustaining because it is accepted. The contrast between the two is unmistakable when seen clearly. One feels like holding something in place. The other feels like resting. This is why the quietest states are often the most powerful. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand attention. They simply are. And imagination, responding to what is taken for granted rather than what is dramatized, moves effortlessly to reflect them. When excitement fades and calm remains, the work has not stopped. It has settled. Fear is rarely about preventing failure. More often, it is about avoiding responsibility. As long as something remains unassumed, it stays hypothetical, distant, and safely out of reach. You can desire it, talk about it, and even work toward it without ever having to confront what it would mean to actually live as the person who has it. Desire keeps the future open. Assumption closes the door, and it is that closure, not the possibility of loss, that unsettles the mind. Assuming the throne is far more frightening than auditioning for it. When you are auditioning, there is always someone else to impress, some condition yet to be met, some authority that has not decided. If things do not work out, you can blame timing, circumstances, or readiness. But once crowned, there is no one left to defer to. The role is no longer theoretical. It is yours, and with ownership comes accountability. You cannot hide behind preparation anymore. This is why many people linger in wanting, even when they understand assumption intellectually. Wanting feels active without being binding. It allows movement without commitment. You can imagine, visualize, and affirm while quietly maintaining an escape route. Assumption removes that escape. It demands that you see yourself differently now, not later, and that shift can feel destabilizing because it dissolves familiar excuses. Beneath this fear is a deeper resistance, the fear of being wrong about yourself. To assume is to declare an inner truth and live with its implications. If the world has not yet caught up, the mind worries it will be exposed as delusional or arrogant, but this concern only arises when consciousness is still divided, when one part accepts the new identity and another part clings to the old one for safety. This is why assumption feels like a point of no return. It changes the internal hierarchy. The old self, with its habits of doubt and delay, loses authority. The new self must be trusted without external confirmation. That transfer of authority is what the mind resists, not because it is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar. When this is seen clearly, fear loses its mystery. It is not warning you of failure. It is signaling that a decision is being avoided. The discomfort does not mean you are unready. It means the old identity is being challenged, and every challenge to identity feels threatening until the decision is made. Once it is made, the fear does not need to be fought. It dissolves because there is no longer anything to protect. Divided consciousness is the only block. Every apparent obstacle traces back to one condition: division within the self. Wanting something while simultaneously denying it is not neutral. It is destructive. The mind pulls in opposite directions not because it is confused, but because it has not decided. One part reaches forward, imagining a different life, while another part tightens its grip on the familiar identity that feels safer, even if it is unsatisfying. This inner split is not dramatic, but it is constant, and over time, it becomes exhausting. Trying to drive with one foot on the gas and one on the brake does not move the car. It overheats the engine. In the same way, divided consciousness burns energy without producing movement. You may feel busy internally, constantly thinking, adjusting, reaffirming, and correcting, yet nothing stabilizes. The effort is real, but it is misdirected. Imagination cannot externalize a contradiction. It reflects the conflict instead, producing delay, inconsistency, and half results that never quite satisfy. This is why techniques feel inconsistent when consciousness is divided. One day they seem to work, the next day they collapse. The individual assumes the problem is discipline, timing, or emotional state, when in reality the issue is allegiance. Which identity is being served? The one that desires change, or the one that expects disappointment? Until that question is settled, the mind oscillates, and oscillation cannot crystallize into fact. Division often hides behind reasonable language. It sounds like caution, realism, or patience. But beneath these justifications is refusal. Refusal to let go of the old story completely. Refusal to accept the new state without proof. This refusal keeps both states alive simultaneously, creating a tug-of-war that never resolves. And because imagination is obedient, it continues to mirror the stalemate. Unity of consciousness does not come from force. It comes from decision. The moment the inner verdict is reached, the division collapses. There is no longer a need to argue, justify, or negotiate. One state is chosen, and the other loses relevance. Neville pointed to this not as a gradual process, but as a doorway. You pass through it, or you remain on the threshold. This is why nothing changes until everything changes inwardly. You can refine methods endlessly, but methods cannot unify a divided mind. Only acceptance can do that. When consciousness stops wanting and starts being, the brake is released. Movement becomes inevitable, not because effort increased, but because resistance ended. There is a reason Neville placed such quiet authority on the state akin to sleep, and it is not because it is mysterious or advanced, but because it is the one condition in which self-deception becomes difficult to sustain. In ordinary waking consciousness, the mind is alert, defensive, and constantly managing impressions. It edits itself, monitors reactions, and rehearses identities. Even spiritual practice can become another role to perform. But as the body relaxes and awareness drifts towards sleep, that management system weakens. The mind no longer has the energy to argue, embellish, or pretend. What remains is not effort, but truth. In this state, the difference between acting and being becomes unmistakable. Acting requires tension. It depends on alertness, control, and a continual checking of whether the performance is convincing. Being requires none of this. As you approach sleep, the body naturally releases tension, and with it goes the ability to sustain a false inner position. This is why you cannot convincingly act in sats. Any identity that has not been accepted feels unstable and fades quickly. The mind simply refuses to hold it. What stays is what feels natural, and what feels natural is what you truly assume. This is also why SATS exposes belief more accurately than any affirmation or daytime visualization. During the day, you can override discomfort with willpower. You can repeat phrases, imagine scenes, and talk yourself into temporary enthusiasm. At night, that scaffolding collapses. The mind is no longer impressed by effort. It settles only into what it recognizes as familiar. This familiarity is not created by force. It is revealed by relaxation. And what is revealed here is the state that has already been granted reality within. When assumption is gently entered in this state, it does not feel like construction. It feels like recognition. The imaginal scene or feeling does not appear as something new or impressive, but as something oddly known. There is no emotional surge announcing success. Instead, there is a quiet sense of course, a subtle settling that carries no urgency. This neutrality is often misinterpreted as indifference, but it is actually acceptance without resistance. The mind has stopped negotiating. What makes SATS so decisive is that it bypasses the divided mind. Desire does not dominate here, nor does doubt argue as loudly. The conscious effort to make something happen dissolves, and with it goes the impulse to perform. This is why Neville emphasized feeling rather than visualization. Feeling in this context is not emotion but ownership. It is the inward knowing that does not need explanation. In SATS, that knowing can be rested in without interference. Once a state is accepted here, it carries a finality that daytime practice often lacks. There is no need to check for results because the inner decision has already been made. The state has been allowed, not forced, and imagination, once impressed in this way, moves outward with a kind of inevitability. The external world does not respond because it is persuaded, but because the inner argument has ended. This is where acting truly dies. There is nothing left to sustain it. No audience, no energy, no reason. Being takes its place quietly without ceremony, and because it happens beneath the level of conscious strain, it often feels almost insignificant in the moment. Yet it is precisely this lack of drama that marks it as real. What is accepted in SATS does not need to be defended. It simply becomes, and the world in time rearranges itself to match what was allowed to feel true. Assumption produces results without announcement. There is a distinct silence that follows true assumption, and it often unsettles those who are accustomed to effort. When identity has genuinely shifted, the impulse to announce, explain, or prove fades naturally. This silence is not secrecy, nor is it restraint. It is the byproduct of authority. When something is accepted as fact internally, it no longer seeks validation externally. The need to speak about it dissolves because there is nothing left to convince. A king does not announce his power each day, not because he is hiding it, but because his position is already established. His presence alone rearranges the room. Conversations shift, behavior adjusts, authority is felt, not declared. In the same way, assumption operates without noise. It does not broadcast itself through words, affirmations, or dramatic confidence. It settles inwardly, and from that settlement, consequences unfold quietly and predictably. This is where many become confused. They expect assumption to feel active, expressive, or emotionally charged. When none of that appears, they assume nothing is happening. But the absence of internal commentary is not absence of movement. It is the sign that movement has already been decided. When identity stabilizes, attention withdraws from the state itself and returns to life. The assumed condition stops being the focus and becomes the background. Results that emerge from assumption often appear unremarkable at first. They do not arrive with fanfare. They come as natural progressions, ordinary developments, or seemingly coincidental shifts. This is precisely why they are so convincing. They fit seamlessly into reality because they arise from a state that felt natural long before it became visible. There is no sense of surprise, only recognition. This also explains why forced effort feels so loud by comparison. Performance depends on signaling. It needs to be seen, reinforced, and acknowledged. It creates inner commentary and outward explanation. Assumption eliminates all of that. When the state is taken as fact, the mind no longer circles it. There is no checking, no monitoring, no emotional investment in whether it is working. The work is finished internally, and imagination carries it forward without further instruction. The authority of assumption lies in its finality. It does not negotiate with circumstances. It does not wait for permission. It does not seek alignment through action. It simply occupies a position and remains there. From that position, behavior, choices, and reactions shift automatically. Not because they are being controlled, but because they now arise from a different center. This is why honesty with self is the law beneath all laws. Imagination does not respond to what you say you want, or even to what you think you believe. It responds to what you accept without argument. When that acceptance is present, results follow as a matter of course. When it is absent, no amount of effort can compensate. Assumption does not demand loyalty through repetition. It commands loyalty through truth. Once the inner position is taken sincerely, everything else reorganizes around it. And because this reorganization happens without noise, without strain, and without performance, it is easy to underestimate its power. Yet it is this very quietness that reveals assumption for what it truly is: identity in motion, needing no announcement, because it no longer doubts itself. Stop pretending. Decide who you are. When everything unnecessary is stripped away, Neville's teaching rests on a single, uncompromising truth. Imagination responds to honesty, not performance. It does not reward effort, enthusiasm, or visible discipline. It reflects the inner position you accept when you stop negotiating with yourself. Pretending may look active, but inwardly it is indecision. Assumption looks passive, but psychologically it is final. Pretending always carries a question mark. It waits for confirmation, permission, or proof. Even when the words sound confident, the inner posture remains conditional. There is still an argument happening inside, still a sense that something must be maintained. This is why pretending feels endless. There is no finish line, because the identity has never been accepted as real. Assumption ends that cycle. It does not ask reality to cooperate. It settles into a conclusion and lets reality reorganize around it. This is why assumption often feels quieter than expected. There is no emotional high announcing success. Instead, there is a subtle absence of effort. The mind stops circling the desire. The identity no longer needs reinforcement. What once demanded attention fades into the background, not because it failed, but because it has been internally resolved. This quietness is not emptiness. It is certainty without tension. James Allen captured this principle clearly when he pointed out that character and circumstance grow from accepted inner truth, not from forced behavior. Circumstances do not respond to what you repeatedly try to be. They respond to what you believe you already are. When identity remains undecided, life reflects instability. When identity settles, life follows suit, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence. The real obstacle then has never been technique. It has been reluctance to decide. You're not stuck because you cannot act convincingly enough. You're stuck because pretending allows you to avoid responsibility. As long as you are working on it, you are not required to live from it. Assumption removes that buffer. It closes the distance between who you are now and who you claim to be. This is where discomfort arises, not because assumption is risky, but because it dissolves excuses. Once the inner decision is made, there is nothing left to blame. The old identity loses authority, and the mind resists that loss. Pretending keeps both identities alive. Assumption chooses one and lets the other fade. No announcement is required. No external signal needs to be sent. The decision happens privately, where effort cannot follow you. You either continue rehearsing a future you refuse to inhabit, or you rest as the person for whom it is already normal. Imagination will reflect whichever position you accept. Assume it now, quietly and fully, or remain loyal to the identity you keep protecting? Decide. Subscribe.